Welcome, everyone. I'm James Brooks, president of SAR. Delighted to have you all come out this evening and join us to hear the second in our lecture series on revolutions. We're welcoming Dr. William A. Parkinson, who's assistant curator of Eurasian anthropology at the Field Museum in Chicago. Dr. Parkinson is a specialist in European and Eastern Mediterranean prehistory and is the American director of the KÖROS Regional Archaeological Project, an international multidisciplinary research project aimed at understanding the social changes that occurred on the Great Hungarian Plain throughout the Holocene. So let's welcome Dr. Parkinson and hear about the age of metal and the evolution of European civilization.
Thank you. Thank you, James. That was a very, very kind introduction. I want to thank everybody for coming out tonight. I really am honored to be here. This is a very big deal for me, especially given the blustery wind out there. They've got me with this Britney Spears mic, so I might break into song in the middle. I'm just warning you. Okay, so this is a basic layout of the talk. Just to give you a lay of the land, a sense of where we're going to be going. It's pretty far-reaching. I'm covering about 6,000 years of European prehistory, so I want everybody to hold on for the ride. I'm going to start with just a general discussion of the age of metal and the spread of civilization, and a little bit of a look at how anthropologists and archaeologists have treated these two things, developments in technology and developments in politics and economics. There's always been a tethering between those two things ever since even the middle of the 19th century. And then I'll talk a little bit about the nuts and bolts, the archaeology of early metallurgy, how we actually study early metallurgy, because it's tricky from several different perspectives. And then I want to talk about the context of early metallurgy in Europe. That is, what kind of societies did it occur within? What kind of implications did it have once metallurgy was first invented and then adopted by different societies in the region? And then if anybody is still awake, I want to talk a little bit about my own field work, not only in Hungary, but in a project I've recently started up with my colleague Mike Galati, in southern Greece, and talk about how I'm trying to make my own sort of modest contribution to our understanding of early villages. And the main point, I'm gonna give you the end of the talk first. The main point I want you to walk away with is that metallurgy was one of several social processes that all came together during this very sort of magical period of the Bronze Age in Europe that laid the foundation for the emergence of the earliest states in Europe, the Minoan and Mycenaean states. But it was only one aspect of many different processes, a whole suite of different social innovations that laid that framework. That's the end of the talk. I'll come back there when I'm done. This was published a couple years ago, and when I read this, it really impacted my whole thinking about what I do. That for the first time ever in 2008, half of the people on the face of the planet live in urban environments. This is really an astonishing fact when you consider the history of humans on the planet. Because as several of you probably know, we evolved not to live in big groups, not to live on top of each other, but to live in relatively small, egalitarian societies where people are moving around a lot. They're hunting and gathering, they're not farming, they're living off the land. This is from a very famous book called Man the Hunter that came out in 1968, which really rewrote how anthropologists understand hunting and gathering societies to exist on the planet. And it basically says 10,000 BC, about 10 million people on the planet, 100% hunters and gatherers. By 1972, 3 billion people on the planet, 0.001% hunters-gatherers. So within this 10,000-year period, we saw a dramatic reorganization in how humans live on the planet. And that affected not only these issues about living in a basically egalitarian form of society, that was our adaptive niche, to live in small groups, move around a lot, share a lot of stuff, and to exist in a way that's very different than we do now. And this has happened relatively quickly in the human experience on the planet. Not only do we now live in these massive cities, but we also have, as we're reminded of every day, dramatic inequalities, political and economic inequalities between humans. This is a process. This is the end result, or the, I guess, middle result, it's still ongoing, of a process that began several thousand years ago. And I think a lot of the nascent forms, the elemental forms of the processes that lead us to the world that we live in today began during this period that I call the Age of Metal, at least in Europe. Now, the Age of Metal, this issue of metal and innovations in technology and innovations in political organization, how civilizations emerge with governments, things that we call states. These have always been tethered, even from the end of the 19th century, when an early American anthropologist, Lewis Henry Morgan, linked in what he called the upper status of barbarism, directly the link between iron and civilization. But it wasn't just people 130 years ago who were doing it. It was also people 80 years ago who were linking the development, the emergence of these states in Bronze Age Europe, in Greece, to metals and to exchange of metals to the Near East, to Egypt and the Levantine coast, the eastern coast of the Mediterranean. This is V. Gordon Childe, very famous European prehistorian, inexplicably with a teddy bear. I don't know where that came from. But in his very, very famous book called The Dawn of European Civilization, he's got a chapter where he explicitly links the emergence of states in Europe to Egypt and the Near East. They're imported. They're adopted. Hey, they got them there. Why don't we do it here? And it's linked to metals and the ability to create swords and to go in and beat up on people. Even more recently, we still see the legacy and this connection between technology and developments in civilization in Jared Diamond's book, which won the Pulitzer Prize. Jared Diamond is a biogeographer. He's trained as an ornithologist. But he writes these very grandiose volumes that a lot of people pay attention to. And it's not an accident that the title of the volume is Guns, Germs, and Steel, because he sees steel as very central and very essential to the ability of Europeans to conquer the rest of the world. There are more, let's say, subtle, less geographically deterministic books out there that still make these same arguments. Recently, two very famous European prehistorians, Christian Christensen and Thomas Larson, published this book on the rise of Bronze Age society. And right at the very front of the book is the core model that has the development. The reason that you get the Bronze Age in Northern Europe is because, if you go down the line far enough, where does it come from? It comes from the Hittites, Egypt, and the Near East. These are all diffusionist models, and this is a very basic instinct in Europe to understand everything as occurring earlier in the Near East. And this can be traced to the medieval period and medieval notions of how the world works. Bruce Trigger, in this book, A History of Archaeological Thought, very, very eloquently talks about how during the medieval period, and here he's talking about the 13th, 14th centuries in Europe, when history was interpreted through a very explicit, literal interpretation of the Bible, there were several basic tenets. One was that the world is recent. It's new. It's a few thousand years old. Because if you follow the begats and the begats and the begats and the begats, that's where you end up. Right? It's also natural for the world. Remember, this is, post-plague. It's not a good time in Europe, right? It's natural that the world is in an advanced state of degradation. It makes sense that things are falling apart, that governments are falling apart, that there are no social morals in Europe. And that is because, number 3 and 4 here, God created humanity in the Garden of Eden, which is somewhere in the Near East, somewhere over there on that eastern coast of the Mediterranean. And the further away you get from that coast, both in time, the longer time that's passed, and the further geographically you get from it, things should be worse. We shouldn't be at that pinnacle that was perfect when God created the world in the Garden of Eden. So it was natural for standards of human conduct to degenerate over space and time. This basic concept still pervades much of European prehistory, and several European prehistorians are still very reluctant to see processes like state development as being indigenous to Europe. Well, it had to come from the Near East, because that's the way everything works. This has been called, in Latin, the ex oriente lux framework, the light from the east. And I love this side because there's light coming from the east, right? And it's this notion that everything begins earlier in that part of the world. And this is a legacy, this is a vestige of that medieval perception of the world, which was based on a literal interpretation of the Bible. So the way that we can explain the emergence of these Mycenaean palaces, these Minoan palaces in Greece and in Crete in the Bronze Age is because, well, they got the idea from the Near East. It came from there. It was an imported idea. Okay, so in order to really understand all these very complex dynamics of how early states emerged and how they related to developments in technology, we need to talk a little bit about the nuts and bolts of the archaeology of early metallurgy. Because metal is a weird material. It's a weird material, and it's a difficult material to study because it is the first truly recyclable technology that was invented by people. We have stone tools, we have basketry, we have pottery. When pots break, something's left behind. When you break a stone tool and you resharpen it, something's left behind. With metal, especially early metals like copper that are very soft, you can completely recycle it. And what that means is you frequently can't find it. So several people were very surprised when a couple years ago an iceman eroded out of a glacier named Ötzi between Austria and Italy. And this was a Neolithic guy. He was a Stone Age guy, but he had with him a massive metal axe, right? And a copper axe, even though he dated himself to the Neolithic period. And this all has to do with the nature of metals being the first recyclable technology, and that has several implications. The other problem, and this doesn't just relate to the study of early metals, but also to just the nature of the archaeological record. What happens with the archaeological record is we never ever, no matter how many times people try to publish it in Science or Nature, we never find the first of anything, ever. Right? We always have the earliest evidence of, but never the first thing. So we can usually assume, like that copper axe with that Neolithic dude, that it existed before we actually find it. So what happens with the archaeological record is it grows backwards in time. We always find that things get older. We never go, oh, we thought that happened 5,000 years ago, but it really was just invented a couple hundred. That never happens. What always happens is we go, oh, it existed 5,000, now it's 6,000, now it pushes backwards. And this is exactly what happened with metallurgy. In the years before we had any form of absolute dating, when all dating was done in a relative format, and you were trying to take a sequence from one site and link it up to a sequence in another site, and eventually try to link it into, hopefully, the Egyptian or the Mesopotamian sequence where you had a deep history. We end up back there. In those years, like when V. Gordon Chao was writing, it was understood that the Copper Age occurred during the second millennium BC. But with the advent of absolute dating techniques like radiocarbon dating, where we can say, not just in a relative manner, but in a more precise manner, this piece of wheat died several thousand years ago, and we could put an absolute date on when that piece of wheat died, it moved back about 1,000 years to the 3rd millennium BC. Then what happened is, as we learned, well, radiocarbon wasn't quite correct, and we can calibrate it using tree rings as the technology develops. Well, then we find, well, actually, the Copper Age now begins sometime during the 5th millennium BC. So we fully moved back the Copper Age 3,000 years, pushing the antiquity of the entire technology back several thousand years. And we've inserted the Bronze Age, which is now shifted back to the 2nd millennium and the 3rd and 2nd millennium BC to take over the rest of that empty space. So because we see, and the other thing, not only does the archaeological record get older, it also gets more complicated. 100 years ago, you only have a couple sites. Everything's a nice, neat little picture. This happened, then that happened, then that happened. Well, then you dig more. You go, well, it's actually more subtle than that. So these grand time frames like the Bronze Age falling right after the Neolithic, well, it doesn't actually work. So in places like Southeastern Europe, we've got this weird thing called the Copper Age, which you don't have in the rest of Europe. This very discrete cultural technology that only works in Southeastern Europe. So this is the complicated picture as we understand it today. 20 years from now, somebody's going to be talking about me, saying, Parkinson, what an idiot. He didn't know what he was doing. But this is where the picture is today. In the late Neolithic, the earliest evidence that we have of use of metals is modification of native copper and native ores. These are pieces that you can find on the ground. You can bang them around, you can modify them, you can take chunks of ore, drill holes in them, and make beads. Here are some examples of armbands that are from securely dated late Neolithic contexts that are native. Then during the Copper Age, during the 5th millennium BC, we have very good evidence of an innovation in that technology where people could not only work with raw metals that they find on the surface of the ground, but they could take rocks that contain metal and suck the metal out of it. That's a process called smelting. And it requires very specific conditions. And we can see this not only in the leftovers, the rocks that have had the metals sucked out of it, these things we call slags, but also in actual mines where we can see in Serbia and Bulgaria, mines where people are chasing the veins of this ore into mountains and using technology that they've developed previously for excavating flint to excavate these ores and to produce tools that are now mold-made and occur in far greater quantity than they did during the Neolithic. The problem with copper is that it's soft. These copper axes are great, but when you try to cut down a tree, it gets really frustrating because it's soft and it bends. And so one of the big innovations that occurred at the end of the Copper Age was the mixing, the alloying of copper with other metals that improve that strength of that material. Initially arsenic, and then eventually with tin. Now, all of this has ramifications, not only with regard to the production of these things and the specialization required to make these things, but also with getting the stuff. Copper doesn't occur everywhere. These ores don't occur everywhere. Copper occurs throughout Southeastern Europe in little pockets. But tin, the closest evidence we have for the ancient use of tin comes from Cornwall in England and Afghanistan. So you're talking about the development of massive, massive trade networks to bring all of these materials in so that specialists could work them down and use them. This gentleman, Lord Colin Renfrew, was really the first one to put he didn't know much less than we know now, even back 40 years ago. And he published two real critical, in addition to a whole slew of other things, he published two real critical arguments. One was this article on the Copper Age, where he said, if we actually sit down and look at the information, it turns out our Copper Age in southeastern Europe is just as early as it is in the Near East, if not earlier. And that has stood the test of time. That we have an independent... Now, European prehistorians hated that because ex oriente lux. Everything comes from the Near East. Everything occurs earlier in Egypt. Doesn't make sense that we've got this just as early, if not earlier, here. The other article, or this was actually his dissertation, was published as The Emergence of Civilization in the Prehistoric Aegean, questioned this whole issue about whether we can actually attribute the emergence of states, the Minoan and Mycenaean states in the Bronze Age of Greece, to any kind of influence from outside. So he kind of brought all this together. I don't want you to try to figure this out. I can't figure it out. I've been looking at it for 20 years. The main point that Renfrew was trying to demonstrate in this very complicated diagram is that nowhere here is there an adoption of states or the adoption of metallurgy. Renfrew understood very clearly that these were independent innovations and that they needed to be understood on their own terms. And it was largely, here's my shameless plug for the book, it was largely the writing of Renfrew and the legacy of Colin Renfrew that led us a couple years ago to organize the session that produced this book. And what we were trying to do in very basic terms was say, okay, Renfrew said this 40 years ago. Where are we now? Has anything changed? And where we basically came to as a group of Near Eastern scholars and Egyptian scholars and Aegean scholars sat around the table was there's very little evidence of direct contact. Renfrew was certainly right about that. If anything, these Aegean states were kind of out of the loop of what was going on. We've had states at this point in the Near East, in Anatolia, the Hittites, and in Egypt for almost 1,000 years at that point. And these little fledgling guys in the Aegean, these little fledgling states want to be a part of that. Hey guys, can we play? Right? And they're trying to work their way into that system, but they're very marginal. All of the contact is down the line, and there's no way you can see these states as creating those states in any meaningful way. So this has resulted in what I think we can think of as this new paradigm. Development of metallurgy occurred over several thousand years. It was a long process with several different stages. These innovations associated with copper smelting and mining were independent, so it took a long time. It was independent. We can't attribute the straits of the Aegean Bronze Age to be associated directly in any way to the innovation, the movement, the adoption of that technology. And the real irony is that there's actually a heck of a lot more evidence for big-scale interaction during the Copper Age in southeastern Europe than there is during the Bronze Age. So that really throws these models like that Christensen and Larson model that links everything that happens all throughout Europe in the Bronze Age to interaction with the Aegean and to the Near East. There's absolutely no evidence to support this model. Okay, so now that we've hammered on old arguments, we've talked about where things stand now, as I said at the beginning, I think the real issue and where we need to go and move forward with research is to try to understand the context of early metallurgy and the social context of early villages generally. And because people for so many years concentrated on one of our other famous revolutions, the Neolithic Revolution, the slide that I started with that talked about the transition from mobile hunting and gathering societies to sedentary agricultural societies. That transition itself has really dominated research. How mobile hunting and gathering societies that lived on the earth for tens of thousands of years became sedentary. And I like this. This is propaganda, right? It says, how goes the hunt? Not so great. How's gathering? Well, so-so. Look, a village. I wonder what they do over there. And it goes along and it tells you all of the benefits, your keys to a better life. Learn which species are slow and submissive. Right? Use food and fences to keep them around. Right? And it's really this basic thinking that has dominated our understanding of early villages. So on the one hand, we've had this study of how hunters and gatherers become sedentary agriculturists. We've done that 30 years, hammering away at it. We know where it occurs, how it occurs. And then on the other hand, we've got, oh, look, big states appear over here. But there's this whole range in between of societies that have really dominated the earth for the last 10,000 years, these agricultural village societies that, they're in the middle. We don't really study them all that much. And the fact of the matter is, at least in Europe, there is a whole suite of very interesting processes that occur within those early village societies. Some that were pointed out by the late Andrew Sherritt, who actually was invited to our SAR Advanced Seminar, but died before, very unfortunately, died before we could put it together, talked about yet another famous revolution, the secondary products revolution, which is a whole suite of different processes that occur that entails not only the killing of animals for meat, for bone, for hide, but also using animals by keeping them around, using them for traction, for plowing, for dairy, for making cheese, for pulling stuff. And Sherritt recognized that this doesn't happen right off the bat with the development of Neolithic agricultural villages. This happens afterwards. The end result of this is that it lets you get more bang for your buck out of an animal. You can get a lot more out of them, and that lets you pull more resources out of any given area. Another thing that isn't necessarily associated with these early villages, with all early agricultural villages, is real intensive, what I think of as intensive sedentism. Yeah, okay, during the Neolithic, all throughout Europe, people started to live in the same place year-round. Okay. But there are certain points in Europe where people didn't just live in the same place year-round. They lived there for generations, or tens of generations, or hundreds of generations, which results in the emergence of sites like this, which we call tells. We use the Arabic word tel, like Tel Aviv. All of this is cultural deposit. This all was deposited over a 3,000-year period of people living on that chunk of land. That doesn't happen everywhere within early agricultural villages. And when it does, it has serious repercussions. Just very quickly, this is from an article I've just published. If we look at what happens in Thessaly, we get agriculturalists about 6,500 BC, and they immediately start to live in the same spot. Right? We see a gradual increase in the number of sites, but they're living on the same spot right off the bat. In Hungary, we get agriculturalists there within a couple hundred years after they're in Greece. But they're moving around, and it's not until 1,000 years later that we see that kind of intensive sedentism and the development of those tells, which then, they only last a couple hundred years, and then they fall apart and people start relocating their settlements. All of these processes have ramifications and implications with regards to political organization. We also see the emergence of territoriality. People start defending territories when you settle down. All of a sudden, it becomes important to defend those different territories, and what we see in the archaeological record is the emergence of these different groups that are archaeological groups on the landscape, but people are starting to now do things differently to actively enforce social boundaries that we don't see prior to that. We also see the very formal institutionalized construction of fortifications around sites. When you live in one spot and you're defending a territory, you're also defending your site. When you get a lot of people living together, that means it's a lot easier to get a bunch of people together to go and attack another village. we also see, through things like metallurgy, the emergence of craft specialization. Not where everybody's doing the same thing, but where now John over there, well, he's making metals, and that's all John's doing these days, is making metals. And so we start to see this variation in how people live within those settlements that they create. One other thing that we see during the Copper Age in Southeastern Europe is, for the first time, big formal cemeteries. Prior to this, you bury Grandpa, outside the house. You bury him next to the wall of the settlement. But during the Copper Age, we see the emergence of these huge cemeteries with hundreds of burials within them that exist on their own in the landscape. And it's within them that we see things like these wild boar's tusks, which are associated with men of a certain age and a certain stature in Hungarian burials during the Copper Age. And what these cemeteries do is they provide another venue for people to show off, right? Look at, when I buried my dad, I had 10 boar's tusks and all of this exotic material and this much copper, and I've got enough going on that I can put it in the ground. All of these there's this whole suite of different processes that together with metallurgy, which is only one small part of that suite, laid the framework and created an environment for the emergence of those early states in Southeastern Europe. We need to understand metallurgy as just one piece of this much bigger puzzle. But because we've had this focus on the one hand, the early Neolithic, and we've also had a focus on site-specific archaeology in Europe, it's been difficult to build that picture. And it's because all of these things need to make sense in different scales of time and over different distances, over different social spaces or different social geographies. And so what we need to do is think about these processes that occur at the continental scale, the movement of agriculture, which takes 2,000 years to get across the European continent. Happens at this big scale over this big period of time. And we need to make sense of those with what's going on in sites. When I show you that tell site, you're looking at the result of people building houses and burning houses and building them. We need to link all these things up. But what has happened in Europe is, on the one hand, we have these grand syntheses, and we've got these individual sites that are excavated. And what's been missing in European prehistory is that regional scale of analysis. And this is what I've been trying to do with my own research in two different parts of Europe. In the Carpathian Basin, these are the Transylvanian mountains over here. These are the Carpathians. This is Transylvania. This is an area called the Great Hungarian Plain, where I've been digging for a while. And this is our site in southern Greece, in the Mani Peninsula of southern Greece. And these are two areas that were very, very distantly related in prehistory. And what they let us do is examine at that regional scale how we can make sense out of those broad processes like the Bronze Age and how they relate to specific sites on the ground. My Hungarian project, which I've been collaborating with my colleague Attila Juha. One of the benefits of working in Hungary is you get to work with a guy named Attila. We've been doing this for 15 years. And it's a project that has really grown from my dissertation days in the 90s to a pretty big, this is our last field season this spring. And what I was trying to do when I first started working in Hungary was understand what happens when those tells fall apart. My interest was, when we get these big sites, we get these people living on top of each other in these big, huge settlements, then they stop. That's unusual, especially compared to Greece. In Greece, once people start living together, they live together more and more and more and more and more. Things continue to build. In Hungary, that doesn't work. It falls apart. And this is the critical part of anthropology, not just understanding what works, where states form, but also understanding where they don't. Why doesn't it happen there? That's just as critical to our understanding of how humans live as understanding the successes. But we've tended to focus on the successes. So my early work was focused on the breakup of the tells at the end of the Neolithic, the beginning of the Copper Age. And of course, one of my pet hypotheses was, hey, it's the Copper Age. People are reorganizing themselves, maybe to deal with the trade of those items. People are moving out. They're trying to get those trade items because it's the Copper Age. So we excavated two sites, these two sites, KÖROS and Vestubikerī, which are both early Copper Age sites, the first settlements to be excavated in this time period. We spent 6 years excavating. I'm thinking we're going to have copper, evidence of copper production, everything all over the place that nobody's seen before, and this is what we got. You can fit it in one hand, the amount of copper. No evidence for copper production on the site. It was a non-issue, which means that my pet hypothesis didn't work. We have to kick that one out. And it also means that we need to then find a more indigenous, a local explanation for why those sites fell apart. In more recent years, we've moved from the early Copper Age back in time to now try and understand why those big sites form. So, okay, we've got agricultural people living in Hungary for a long time. They're there for 1,000 years. And then for some reason, they start to live together in these big, huge sites. What's up with that? Why do they live in those places, in those particular spots on the landscape? And what we've been able to do is build, having worked in this region for a long time, we know what works and we know what doesn't. Things like magnetometry, where you basically carry a big magnet across the ground and you take readings and you look for changes in the readings of the Earth's magnetic field, which lets you see buried features. It's non-invasive, which is good because archaeology is expensive when you start to dig. You want to get as much information off the surface. And we do that the old-fashioned way, too, by laying down 10 by 10 meter grid squares in muddy plowed agricultural fields and picking up all the ceramics to try and get a sense of how these sites emerge and how they change over time. And the picture that we can build is really, it's surprised everyone. So when we started working in this region, here's a nice little tell, it's about 100 meters by about 70 meters. Cute little tell that builds up over time. And as we started working in the region, we identified around that tell a massive, all of these are longhouses, the remnants of longhouses, massive settlement all the way around the tell that take that tiny little 2-hectare tell and make it about 50 hectares. It spreads over this massive, massive region. These are proto-urban centers. And this is one that doesn't work. It falls apart. So by using the information that we get from magnetometry, using radar on top of the ground, and our little grid squares that we get down on our hands and knees and pick up pottery, we can actually build, without putting a shovel in the ground, a pretty good picture of how this site comes about. This is a distribution of the ceramics. Here's the tell. And what you see is there's little densities of ceramics, lots of ceramics down here, lots of ceramics here. And this is a distribution of burned wall rubble. When you've got wattle and daub walls, kind of like adobe walls, and those houses burn, you find little chunks of that clay on the ground. And there's differences between these two patterns. And by looking at them, what we can see is that the only place that has early stuff and later stuff is on the tell. So the tell is established first, and then there's some sort of social gravity that pull people to this place where they live for a couple hundred years, and then they fall apart. And the only place that continues is on the tell. My other project, now that Hungarian project's been up and running for several years. My other project in southern Greece is just getting rolling. And here we are, we're in the Mani Peninsula of southern Greece. And we're working in this bay right here, which is called DIROS Bay. And this is a real interesting part of the Greek peninsula. This is as far as you can be, as far south as you can be in Europe and still be in Europe. Right? It's the southern tip of Europe. And at the southern end of this peninsula is the classical entrance to Hades. That was the entrance to hell. It's a weird peninsula in a lot of ways, not just because it has the entrance to Hades. But it's weird culturally because it's separated from the rest of this is Greece. This is southern Greece. As far as south as you can be in the European continent, you have snow, right? This is a massive mountain range that cuts off that peninsula from the whole rest of the Greek mainland. And as a result, you get several different cultural patterns down there that make it very distinct and very discrete from the rest of Greece. It also has a very deep archaeological history, with Apidima, one of the earliest Lower Paleolithic, well-dated Lower Paleolithic hominid sites in Europe, being located right north of our bay, right on the edge of our bay. So we've got Lower Paleolithic, we've got Mesolithic, Neanderthal time period sites, right up to the modern day. This is the remnants of a tower town. This was one of the places in Greece where you still had blood feuds into the middle of the 20th century. People were building these massive towers, and you have these towns that are all these stone. This doesn't look like Greek architecture. You have these stone-built towers, and it's because they're beating up on their cousin who lives on the other side of town. It's very culturally distinct, and it's always been autonomous. This is a church in Lemeni Bay, the next bay north, that is right next to the place where Mavro Michalis, who led the Greeks against the Turks, against the Ottomans, during the Greek Revolution, was born. This place prides itself on being different, it prides itself on being autonomous, and it still doesn't like associating itself with the Greek nation-state. I've been very fortunate to work both with my colleague Michael Lottie, but also this gentleman, Yorgos Papathanasopoulos, and his lapdog Juju, who goes everywhere with him. And my other colleagues, Takis Karkanas and Anastasia Papatanasiou, who both work with the Greek Ministry of Culture, to get this project off the ground. And you can see it doesn't get much more different from the flat plain of Hungary. Here we've got mountains, we've got a short little coastal plain, and then boom, the sea right down here. And the reason that we focused on this particular bay on the Mani Peninsula is because of a cave that's located right up here. And that cave is called Alepotripa Cave. This is called Foxhole Cave. And this is a cave that goes back about half a kilometer into the hill. And so we've got an entrance out here. The sea's right over here. We've got the entrance here. There's a little opening. And then it goes back. There's some chambers. Then it explodes into this massive cavern. And then in the back, we've got a freshwater lake. This is my bad attempt to try to take a picture of that big cathedral room. There's Mike right there. I don't know if you can see him right there. I mean, you get a sense of this. It's massive, massive cave. And the reason it's important, this is the front end, and here you can see some of the archaeological sections exposed, is because there are over 6.5 meters of deposit in the cave that are associated with archaeological sediment. It's occupied at exactly the same time as the site that I'm working on in Hungary. It starts in the Middle Neolithic, it ends in the Bronze Age. And when you've got this much cultural deposition, it's like having a tell inside the cave. Only here we know that it's used for much more than settlement. Here we've got massive cemeteries, massive ossuaries. And what makes it very special is not only that because it's a cave, it's very well preserved, but also that at the very end of the occupation of the cave, this is the surface. This is what the surface of the cave. These are all ceramics. That's lined with ceramics. And what's laying on top of the ceramics are several dead children that are covered up by the calcium carbonate, the stalactites that drip off. It looks like the entrance of the cave collapsed and people were trapped inside. it's kind of got that Pompeii effect to it. Because most of the Greek caves, the Romans came, they messed them up. The Turks came, they messed them up. In World War II, people put military garrisons in them. They're all messed up. In this case, it's very pristine. It was occupied until the beginning of the Bronze Age. It was sealed and wasn't open until 1958. Cave's located right over here, and we know there are several other Neolithic. There's another Neolithic cave right there. And so what we've been trying to do is put that cave into its regional context. Because again, the only way we can make convincing arguments about what happened in the past is to focus at that regional scale. And here I've got a perfect comparison of what's going on in Hungary. Same time period, same issues, same social environment, but a very different environment, a very different natural environment. So what we did, the cave is situated right here. This is a topographic map of the eastern end of the bay. This last summer, we got just a little bit of money and started to do some work. And one of the first things that we identified was a massive site right outside the entrance to the cave that we did our Hungarian-style collection. We got down all of our hands and knees. And what we identified was a massive settlement right outside the entrance to the cave. What's real interesting about this is that it looks like a very similar picture to what happened in Hungary. The cave was inhabited first. There was a fluorescence. There was some sort of social gravity that were pulling people to those places. It lasted for a few hundred years, and then it fell apart. So, we see several parallels at the same time periods in the coming together of all of these different processes that characterize these early villages. And by my continued work in both of these regions, as long as my wife will let me, I hope to make some modest contribution to our understanding of what happened. So this is where we end up. Ex Oriente looks doesn't work. We can't buy into that light from the east model. Metallurgy was a local innovation in Southeastern Europe. It was one of several innovations that occurred within these early village societies that together, the coalescence, that suite, that magical suite, that coming together of all those different processes eventually created that environment for the emergence of those early civilizations, the Minoan and Mycenaean states. But in order to really understand what happened, we need to look at those early villages, and we need to study them at multiple scales. We can't just continue to excavate single sites and build these fantastic models that talk about what happened at the continental scale. And that's all I have today. Thank you.